Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Josh, let's talk about some board games. I know entertainment in the family sometimes involves board games and entertainment of that sort. I had one that was kind of farm related growing up. Tell me a little bit about any of your board games that you loved playing with friends or siblings or family members, what you had going on.
When I think about board games, I think about going to my grandparents' house and just pulling one right off the shelf. And that one would have been Monopoly. Right away, pulling off Monopoly, starting a 4 to 5 hour game, sitting down, starting arguments. That's what I think of board games. But in my young Gen Z self, I think of instantly video games. So I'm part of that era that we played board games, but we started moving towards the digital platform. So I remember playing my PlayStation 2 a lot. I remember hopping on Facebook back in the good old days when there was Farmtown and Farmville, creating my farms out there, doing Farming Simulator. That's a game that's really popular right now where you get your whole farm and you're able to customize it, grow everything, sell everything. And it's just a very digital world. What about you, Bruce? Did you do any of that?
Well, not so much the digital, of course, and you're probably kind of showing my age here a bit, but there were some board games back growing up. Yeah, we definitely pulled them off the shelf. Would have been still at my mom and dad's or me growing up. We had one that was really cool, and know that my dad was a career-long vocational agriculture teacher. So he had this game that we used in the classroom, but ironically, in the world that I work in today, the game was called Farm Management. This was a game in the 1960s and 70s, and it was made by a company called Big Top Games. And Big Top Games, everybody had their own farmstead, kind of like a play mat, and we all had our own money and acres, and we could do things like raise crops and raise cattle, buying and selling grain. We had resources that we had to manage as far as field equipment and operations. The really cool thing about this particular board game, think of a really small loaf of bread, okay? And that size, that really small loaf of bread, think of a cardboard rectangular box. Inside that box was a cylinder, and there was this little stem that reached out the box, and you would spin it. Well, that was the marketplace. That was the weather forecast. It set prices. It also set how many acres that we would get done as far as field operations. And it was just a really cool spinning device that was this random factor in this board game. The estimated time to play this game, it was 2 to 6 players, 360 minutes right there on the box. That's 6 hours. And I agree to that time frame because we took some Saturday afternoons, Sunday afternoons and played this game. It was just a whole lot of fun for our family to do. And we still have this game. It is a good memory and a fun activity to still get involved with.
Bruce, that sounds like such a fun game. Today's topic, I think, actually might have been a part of that game. We're going to be talking about the maximum return to nitrogen rate calculator that we have through the extension program. So today's guest is Greg LaBarge. Greg is a field specialist in agronomic systems and a professor at Ohio State University Extension in Columbus, Ohio. Research interests are primarily related to that nutrient management impacts on crop production and water quality. He has served on various committees, including Ohio Phosphorus Task Force Phase 2, the 4R Certified Ag Retailer Program Board, the Ohio Certified Crop Advisor Board, and many others, incorporating his agronomic production and water quality expertise. He has a Master's of Science in Agronomy from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Thanks, Bruce. And now over a 39-year career, I've got a PhD in working with a lot of farmers and talking about nutrient management issues.
So, Greg, we're going to jump right on in with our first question. So, tell us some of the different ways you've studied nitrogen response in corn through your years of research with Ohio State University.
Yeah, I started nitrogen rate management research back in 1996, and the constant has been looking at nitrogen rates in two different rotations where we have soybean corn and then corn back to corn. The other factors we've thrown in along the way include nitrogen source, where we're thinking about urea or UAN versus ammonia. We talked a little bit at times about population, so looking at nitrogen rates over different populations, looking at late season nitrogen application, a big trend there for a while of thinking about late nitrogen as we got towards tasseling, looking at starter and no starter and including sulfur in that. And then with manure utilization up in Northwest Ohio, we've talked a lot about rates over top of different manure applications.
That's a great wide range of topics that really answered a lot of questions, I think, for producers over the years. And one that I did last week, Greg, is I looked up the OSU corn budget for 2026 and I pulled together some of the fertilizer cost per acre. And no surprise, nitrogen was the highest percentage cost of nutrient for an acre of corn at 68%. And then I looked back 10 years ago and it was 64%. And then I looked back 20 years ago at 2006, and nitrogen was very similar, 65% of the fertilizer cost per acre. So nitrogen has really a history of being or carrying a majority of the cost per acre for the nutrient portion. And I think sometimes we might take it for granted, but remind us, why is nitrogen so important in this corn plant that we grow?
Yeah, really, it revolves around the volume of nitrogen that we need to ultimately get into the plant to support yields. When we talk about nitrogen capability of supplying from the soil, it's pretty limited based off of mineralization of organic matter. And to really maximize yields, we do have to spike some nitrogen into the system from a fertilizer standpoint. So that's a very important factor. The other piece is it takes about 1 to 1.3 pounds of nitrogen in the plant to support a bushel of corn production. Basically, we harvest about half of that with grain, but we also have to remember there's a large plant there that we have to support during the growing season. So it turns out to be a lack of ability from the soil to supply nitrogen that we need to add nitrogen into the system.
So, Greg, I've had a lot of conversations with farmers where they come in and tell me what is the maximum amount of fertilizer I need to put down to get that maximum yield. And those conversations seem to be changing. When is the conversation about nitrogen rates changing from yield goals to that maximum returns of nitrogen? When did that start to occur?
Really, the fertility agronomists across the Midwest region started talking about nitrogen rates, and their observation was that nitrogen didn't follow a straight path. In other words, we could put on a pound of nitrogen and get a half a bushel or maybe a bushel and a quarter. And what we saw was total nitrogen rate, and comparing that to yields, it looked like a shotgun on a graph. In other words, we couldn't target it very well just based off of pounds of nitrogen applied. So at that point, they started looking at different ways that we can make nitrogen recommendations. And what they settled upon was thinking about the cost of nitrogen, the price of corn, and the nitrogen response curve, and looking for that place on the curve where we end up with the maximum economic return to a acre of corn production. So that conversation was good. Actually, we've had a lot of research projects that have looked at MRTN compared to other methods of making nitrogen recommendations, which there are several different recommendation options that people can follow. And what it ends up with is MRTN comes out near the top in relationship to maximizing yield and also making that economic calculation at the end of the year look better.
So, Greg, one of your credentials that you've earned in your profession is that you're a certified professional agronomist. And as you've worked with growers over the years and you've understood the nature of nitrogen, I guess, in different environments, what is it that makes nitrogen essentially a nutrient that we supply during the growing season, during the production season, rather than in most cases, especially for parts of Ohio, rather than the fall application of nitrogen? How does that nitrogen compare differently to what we might think of as phosphorus and potassium nutrients?
Yeah, good question. And we kind of think about nitrogen and its most stable form, and actually its most stable form is in the air as a gaseous form. The air that we're breathing today is 78% nitrogen. So that is where nitrogen likes to be, other than where we get it incorporated into organic matter in the soil. The reality of nitrogen being pretty fleeting in the soil system is what leads us to having to make that annual application, or in this case, where we have a corn soybean rotation, in a lot of cases, making the nitrogen application for that corn crop, because we know that whatever is left over at the end of the season really isn't going to be there for that crop coming up the next year. So we kind of start all over annually with nitrogen and understanding what we need to apply from a soil's perspective. With P and K, we've got a totally different situation. Those two ions are very stable in the soil, and especially when we compare them to nitrogen, but they are stable in the soil. They have soil pools or fractions that continue to supply the soluble portion in the soil. So we can use a soil test and make a good recommendation in relationship to P and K, whereas nitrogen, much more fleeting with our environment that we have. Basically, we start all over every spring season with nitrogen and making recommendations and applications.
Greg, we mentioned at the beginning with the title talking about this calculator to find that ideal nitrogen rate. Where do you direct those producers and crop advisors to find that calculator, and tell us how it works?
The actual web address is cornenratecalc.org, and that's first part of that is all one word. Honestly, the best way to find it is go to Google and type in corn nitrogen rate calculator for Ohio, and it will come up for you, and you can go to that link then and start to take a look at it.
So Greg, as I go online and I look at this calculator, it seems like that one of the things that I might want to enter into the calculator isn't quite there. My yield goal for 2026 does not appear to be something that I enter into the calculator. Is the yield irrelevant, or is that kind of data happening or working behind the scenes with this calculator?
Yeah, good question. And a lot of folks ask that. And when we look at the data that's behind the calculator, what it is a number of different nitrogen rate trials. In other words, where we put down rates in 50-pound increments up to 250 pounds, and we look at what the yield response is off of those different rates. And we have a number of years worth of data in that calculator, so it provides us some stability over time in different environments. And with that, we get yield response to nitrogen. And what the calculator does is we enter into that the price of the nitrogen that we are paying for, and then what we're going to receive as far as a corn price based off of our marketing for the upcoming year. What ends up happening in the calculator is that we take the corn yield response to each unit of nitrogen, and we take that response of yield times the price of corn, and then we take what each additional unit of nitrogen cost us and subtract it off that yield. And what we end up with is a maximum return to nitrogen, or we're looking at the economic return to nitrogen that we are applying into the system. With that, we provide, when you get to the top of the curve, we look at diminishing returns. And when you get to the top of a curve, we have where that last unit of nitrogen is very similar to the last unit as far as yield, but there's just a little bit left. So we have a pretty wide range at the top of that curve that allows us to look at plus or minus the amount of nitrogen. And it's normally about 10 or 15 pounds of nitrogen plus or minus that yields a very similar return per acre. And folks can take a look at that if they're more sensitive to applying less nitrogen and want to take that higher rate. They're still going to be in the ballpark as far as return. And likewise, if they like to look at that input cost and be most efficient from that standpoint, they can go to the lower end of that price range.
So, Greg, as a researcher and a scientist, we always like to get more data. More data makes us be able to make our calculators a little bit better. So how does a producer or an Ohio corn grower get involved with this nitrogen response calculator? Is there a way they can help contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. We love on-farm trials related to this topic of nitrogen rate response. And Would encourage you to give me a call, give your local extension educator and county office a call, and check with them on interest in doing this. Kind of the parameters are that you're interested in doing 4 or 5 rates of nitrogen, and you will start at least at 50 pounds and move up. We really like a 0 nitrogen rate in that, but it doesn't need to be a quarter of the quarter mile field length plot to do that 0 plot either. And the other thing that I would think of, in addition to providing information for the MRTN calculator, is simply the fact that you get that nitrogen response on your farm. And in fact, about half of the data that's in the nitrogen rate calculator tool is on farm projects, just like what we were talking about, Josh.
Greg, I think I learned to do some of the research that I was always involved with from you, and I love how you lay out research. It's replicated, randomized, complete block type of design. And then by doing so, you end up having a lot of confidence in the response of that nitrogen that we're putting in there. And research is happening across Ohio State, and you're not alone at Ohio State doing the crop fertility research. Tell us who else at Ohio State is doing crop fertility research, and what are some of the areas that are being worked on behalf of Ohio producers, maybe even across soybeans and other crops like wheat that your colleagues are working in?
Yeah, sure. Can't help but start mentioning Dr. Manbir Rakar, who is our state soil fertility specialist. She has spent a lot of time in her new position, 3 years now into her tenure here at Ohio State, working on phosphorus trials of our variety crops, but also starting to get into nitrogen management and timing in relation to wheat production. Dr. Ed Lentz up in Northwest Ohio has done a lot of wheat research, and there are several other specialists across the state that do some work in their cropping area. Laura Lindsay with soybeans, Osler Ortiz with corn, and then we have a lot of our educators in our county offices that are doing things. So if you're hearing a presentation over the winter about fertility information from a local educator, you might want to check into them and see what they're doing locally.
Greg, before we end the podcast today, is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
I would state up front that MRTN isn't a perfect tool, but it is really a good place to start. You know, in history, there was a time in my career where we said, we might need another 40 pounds of nitrogen, and we just went ahead and put that insurance out there. But that insurance policy cost us a lot more today than what it did in the past. And so with that, we want to take full advantage of that tool as a beginning point to the conversation about what nitrogen rate do I do this year.
Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.